How's it going, everybody? Happy Wednesday. It's my favorite Wednesday of the month. It's Webinar Wednesday. And I'd like to say that we actually had a better reason for doing these webinars on Wednesday other than my sick sense of humor, but that might be a little bit of a lie. So we're just, gonna have to deal with it. But anyway, I'm really excited about the topic today. We're right at the top of the hour. Normally, we give folks about 1 to 2 minutes to trickle in so that we can make sure we get started all on the right foot. So I'm going to give it another minute or so before we get started on the topic today. In the meantime, I love to engage with all the folks here that show up to these webinars. Obviously, we put them out as an educational content way of giving back to the community, especially to help with some of the life lessons, vulnerability management lessons that we see working with customers. So to get things started, I'd love to hear where all of you are joining us from today. If you wouldn't mind dropping in the chat where you're actually hailing from and listening in. We get a pretty international crowd, so it's always fun to see where everybody's joining us from. So if you don't mind sharing, I'd love to see where everybody's calling in from today. And that'll give us the extra minute to let folks come on in. Atlanta, right next door. I am in Jacksonville. So those of you out here in the U.S. South, you know how hot it is right now. So I appreciate you stepping out of the heat to join us today. And we're definitely not jealous of the weather elsewhere right now I guess it's July in Florida. But any of you who's lived in Florida knows what I'm talking about. And yeah, this is good stuff. We've got a great crew today. Amazing. All right, we are 2 minutes after the hour, so I'm going to go ahead and jump in and get started. Excellent. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the monthly webinar series for Nucleus, where we don't talk about our product. We talk about all of the things around vulnerability management that we learn as we go through this process and built on the experience of our team and the collective experience of our customers as we're really solving this vulnerability management process challenges that we all experience. And one thing that comes up all the time is how do you actually remediate and manage vulnerabilities that are not CVE based, right? It's a big topic. We could talk about CVEs, non-CVEs for days. I even wrote an article at one point, I think it was in HelpNet Security a few months ago, about why we might need CVEs for the cloud, for example, because of just the way that this works out. But today we're going to stay laser focused on how do you actually triage and think about and prioritize vulnerabilities that are non-CVE based. So that's the goal today. We're going to jump in. First of all, for those that don't know me, my name is Scott Kuffer. I'm actually one of the co-founders of Nucleus Security. Nucleus Security is a tool. If you're not familiar with us, we do vulnerability aggregation and build a specialized data fabric on which you can do all your automation and vulnerability response. But we're not going to talk about that today. What we're going to focus on is all of the vulnerability management processes that make up a larger VM lifecycle. So the agenda, we're going to talk about why this is even a problem. We're going to talk about the differences that you experience between CVEs versus non-CVE based findings. We're going to focus on how do you respond and how do you align a response at a high level within your organization. And then finally, we'll jump into our wrap up and key takeaways so that hopefully you can take something back strategically and implement in your organization. Finally, we're going to do a dedicated Q&A, but I just want to be really clear that you're welcome to drop questions into the chat at any time. Chat, we also have a little Q&A button. I do my best to answer these questions live on air. So if something comes up that you want to dive into or ask about, we will do our best to answer them live also. Please be overly communicative. I could talk all day. Those that know me, I was just talking to the team backstage. I can talk for days on my own. So definitely feel free to add the questions. We'll address them, all that sort of fun stuff. And we love collaboration. So that's why we're here. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump in. So I want to start with, before we talk about like how do you actually manage CVEs and then non-CVEs together in a single place, I want to talk about why this is a topic, because realistically, non-CVEs, which we call findings, have been around for ever, right? So you've got tons of different types of findings and risks that you need to manage as a vulnerability management expert. But what's happened is that there's been an acceleration of where it really matters. And it's something that you as a VM team have to respond to and manage yourself. And there's really been three main factors that have led to this, right? The first is thanks to our good friends at AWS, leading to mass adoption of cloud environments. So when you're talking about what's driven a lot of this, it actually is the fact that we are migrating a lot of our infrastructure from your owned or organization owned infrastructure to cloud owned infrastructure, right? So the rental economy is a big part of this. It actually kind of reminds me of, for those of you that may have been around for this, but in the 90s, you actually, and probably still today, I don't know these days, but you actually used to buy printers, and then it transitioned to renting printers, and you would just rent ink, and somebody would come out once a month and do service calls. We've done something similar with our infrastructure, and so that's led to a lot of changes in how we actually think about risk within a vulnerability management ecosystem. And I'll get into that here in a moment. But the second thing that's actually changed, that's driven this adoption of non-CVE based vulnerabilities, is how we use our IT infrastructure in the first place, right? When you compare and contrast what we were doing previously, say 10 years ago even, you look at, it was very workstation centric. It's very, in your network, everybody's on a LAN. There might be a few people who are using VPNs, things of that nature. But the way we actually leverage our IT systems, even ones that are not in the cloud, has drastically changed as well, right? Even the whole concept of zero trust, which, we could debate about zero trust all day, but even the concept of zero trust being invented and created and used is evidence of just how much our IT landscape has changed, especially in the work from home culture and bring your own device. It's really changed how we even think about traditional IT management. It has caused a lot of changes there as well. And then finally, you have this shift that occurred around 2019, 2020 timeframe, where phishing assessments and credential stuffing used to be the number one way that exploitation occurred inside of an environment, that really shifted to now where vulnerabilities themselves. And I'm going to clarify what I mean by vulnerability here in a minute, by the way. For those of you that are screaming internally about my misuse of the word vulnerability, that has drastically changed as well. So where we see over a third of all known root cause of how attackers get into an environment is through vulnerability exploitation, no longer from phishing and credential stuffing. So those are sort of the three big factors that we see that's really driven a lot of this adoption and changing of the environments that's led to this requirement for really reevaluating our relationship with non-CVE based findings. Now, what that means is the risk calculus. I call it the risk calculus. I don't know what other folks call it, but basically it's like, what's our overall calculations and algorithms for how we think about risk in our business? That has changed pretty dramatically because of these, right? So what we're looking at here is your traditional vulnerability management lifecycle, which traditionally you're just looking at as patch management, right? Everybody thinks about VM and it's, hey, patch Tuesday. How do we run patches within SLAs, those types of things, right? So this is your traditional patch cycle. You start with your discovery of what you want to patch. You look at what vulnerabilities have been discovered, and you look at patches become available. You assign the patch, you run the patch, you repeat the process, and hooray, VM has been achieved. Check the little box on our compliance assessments, SOC 2, PCI, all that sort of fun stuff. We're on our way. Then we move on with our lives. Now, what that means, though, is modern vulnerability management is a very different experience than vulnerability management was 10, 15, or even 5 years ago. We've transitioned from patching as the primary method of risk remediation to having a whole lot of different categories of processes that we need to manage. You've got traditional patch management, right? But you also have configuration management. You have infrastructure as code. You have CI/CD and software development. You've got things like user behavior and analytics. And there's tons of tools to assess risk within each of these categories. And vulnerability management, which is historically technical risk or technical severities, and how do we assess our technical controls, and how do we shift that mindset from patch management to what modern VM looks like. And so what's happening is because of the shift of what vulnerability management is, it means that what's happening is you actually have decreasing direct risk from what we would consider traditional vulnerabilities, right? So, hey, we forgot to patch a Windows system. Your actual accumulation of the amount of risk and number of vulnerabilities, we see that's actually going down into the traditional patch management lifecycle, right? Patching is still extremely important. I'm not saying that it isn't. Please keep patching. But it is really undeniable that we're accumulating much more risk in other areas of our businesses, that it's unclear if VM should own that or if we should have specialized teams that own that. And I'll get into what those look like. But what that means is that as decreasing direct risk from traditional vulnerabilities, what's happening is we're getting increased risk to our businesses from non-traditional findings and also from just offloading risk to other places, right? So if we think about what we're doing when we're offloading to AWS, we're actually having AWS, we're assuming the risk of AWS doing all of the patching for us, at least at the infrastructure level, right? And so now our focus needs to go from maintaining the infrastructure security to now we have to maintain the security of the stuff that runs on the infrastructure. And we actually, whether we know it or not, we're accepting a huge amount of responsibility from AWS doing what they're supposed to with the infrastructure, which is where we can see some really big results and really big impacts if AWS doesn't do their job effectively. Now, we've been very fortunate. Organizations like AWS have been doing a great job. But that being said, you look at Microsoft, there was a whole bunch of Azure stuff going on last year, right? And so when we're highly dependent on other vendors for renting space from them, what it means is that we're actually increasing the risk pretty dramatically from non-traditional places, right? So not our patch management types of places. Now, what that means is that vulnerability management has become really complicated. So I did my best to visualize this. I'll be the first to tell you, I am not a visual expert in how to display items, but you have this kind of perfect storm of actions and scenarios that are occurring, right? You've got patching that you have to continue to do, but now you have a whole bunch of new software development that needs to occur. You have configuration management that needs to happen. And then at the center of it all is vulnerability management itself, right? So vulnerability management, if we think about VM not just as a patch management solution, it's not just a team that all they do is patching. We think about VM as the team that is designed and whose job it is to reduce technical risk in the business. They really have to have responsibility in a lot of different areas, which has led to huge amounts of confusion in just environments in general, as well as how do you actually approach this from a process and strategic perspective. And also there's some budgetary questions here as well. But it's interesting because if you look at the intersection between software development and your patching, that's where your custom development security and technical risk comes from. If you look at software development and configuration, right? So this is where, hey, we're writing code and we're deploying it to a cloud environment. That's where your DevOps and CI technical risk comes from. And then your standard patching and configuration on workstations is at the OS level, right? And so you have vulnerability management sitting in the middle of all of this, but they have to be able to manage as a business, or we as organizations have to be able to manage as a business these different areas of specialization where risk is actually showing up. And there's a lot of different ways that organizations are doing that, but we're going to walk through some of the most common ways here now. Now, I always love examples, and I definitely, love to talk a lot, but where I like to show up an example of this is actually in MongoDB. Now, this happened 2018, 2019 timeframe. So this is about 5 years ago now, but we had 188 million records exposed on one MongoDB database, and we had tons of exfiltration of data. This was just one example of where we've been bitten by configurations, right? So configurations lead to breaches as much as just traditional CVEs. So the question becomes, how do you manage and how do you think about the risk of something like this? And how do you manage it? How do you prioritize it? And how do you respond to it the same way when your job is to look at CVEs, right? So the question is, are vulnerability management teams Is there area of focus to reduce CVEs, or is it to reduce overall risk? So understanding the boundaries of what we should be working on as vulnerability teams becomes extremely fuzzy really quickly, and it becomes something that organizations actually handle differently. And I'm here to tell you that there actually are ways to handle this all in one place, and I'll show you how we can do that here in a second. But the main point here is that these are not traditional vulnerabilities, but they're high risk at the same time. And so you need to be thinking at your threat model level, how do you actually manage all this data in one spot? So we need to be thinking about redefining what vulnerabilities mean to us and to the business. Now, there's the traditional definition of it's a weakness, right, in a piece of software. And then we have the CVE definition of a vulnerability. And those are really different constructs. And so the issues that you run into are you have your CVEs and, actually fun fact here. This is a fun interactive. We're going to make this interactive. I'm going to make you guys have some fun. These are all some really famous CVEs. I would love to know if anybody knows what these are off the top of their head, which CVEs these reference and what they belong to. So type that in the chat, give you something. So everybody knows Log4j. I'm like, that's a good one, but we got some OGs, like some of the original Log4js in here. It's gonna be fun. So you have CVEs themselves, and then on the left-hand side, you have other types of findings, right? And so I have two examples here. One is CWEs, right, which are broader categories of vulnerabilities. And then you have below it, you have a CIS benchmark for a Windows 10 enterprise server. And the question you have to start asking yourself is, well, if my job is to decide where the business should invest engineering resources to reduce risk, do I have to do those in two separate locations? Or can I integrate these findings on the left-hand side into my CVEs construct? And it becomes really interesting to start thinking about how do you manage this. And the reason I bring this up is because most vulnerability scanners, traditional vulnerability scanners, DAST scanners, et cetera, report different types of findings, right? You look at a Tenable scan, it's not just CVEs. There are other types of findings in there, like weak SSL. How many people have seen the weak SSL plugin from Nessus? What am I supposed to do with that? How does that factor in to my prioritization? And we all have different ways of dealing with it, but this is the root of the challenge that we're experiencing when it comes to combining these into one spot. Now, I'm going to just give an example here. This is probably overkill, but I'm going to do it anyway. So when we look at non-CVEs, there are a whole bunch of different types of findings that can be non-CVE specific, right? One of the most common is something called the CIS benchmarks. Now, CIS benchmarks, great, where we have an industry-wide kind of movement to document good configuration controls. So for those that don't know, CIS benchmarks is all about like the proper secure configuration of a device, right? So these would be like the things that like a CSPM tool, like a Wiz or a, Wiz or Lacework or Orca, they will, basically pull this out for your cloud environments, those types of things. Now, CIS is just one of the many benchmarks out there. And we have this really interesting dilemma where we actually have tons of different benchmarks for even the same types of outcomes. And so if you look at it, right, so on the right-hand side, I just opened up, this is a whole bunch of reference information from Nucleus. So we actually gathered this inside of Nucleus. And this is for one finding inside of Nucleus. This one finding maps to NIST 800-171, NIST 800-53, CSF, PCI, version 3.1, version 3.2, Swift. There's tons of compliance controls and benchmarks out there where every vendor effectively feels like they have their own. And so we're in a similar position with benchmarks and with configuration that we were actually in 30 years ago when we were trying to figure out how do we communicate vulnerabilities across different tools. And so how do you actually go about and make that happen is part of the issue. So we have all these rabbit holes, right? We have these rabbit holes that you have to dive into every single time you want to start just normalizing one new set of data. And in this case, with CIS benchmarks, you basically can only receive them via PDF. and you have to enter your information in there. And so you generally have to outsource that to a vendor that pays CIS for the privilege of being able to map via code. You can also pay for it yourself, but it doesn't solve the fundamental problem. So what do we actually do about it? The first question that I always start with is triage, right? So a lot of folks, when they look at a vulnerability management process, they'll start with prioritization. Now, prioritization is definitely important, and we will get to prioritization here in a moment. But I actually believe that you need to start with triage. And the reason you need to start with triage is because it's a broader stage of your VM process. And my computer is crashing. So hopefully that didn't happen to everybody there. But anyway, the show must go on. So you have your triage. So the triage phase is a much broader stage of your process. And what it means a few things. The first is it means looking at your information and all of the data that's coming in. It means normalizing the data. It means cleaning the information. And it means making decisions and putting it in a format that you can then prioritize and respond to. So I love starting with triage first, especially when you're first getting started in a VM program. And how do you start normalizing different types of findings together? And you may ask, Scott, how do I actually go about doing this? Well, I normally start with a threat model. So threat models, big scary word, I know we've all spent tons of time looking at these big threat modeling projects. We have to go application by application and go, well, what's the impact of this, and building these big models. But I'm here to say that you can do some very basic threat modeling. And if you use a threat modeled approach to vulnerability management and to normalizing your data, you actually have a ton of benefit from that. And where that normally ends up, right? So this is the shortcut here, right? So you would normally go, okay, well, I have these findings. What attributes about these findings make it that would be something that I would consider high risk? And generally, there's two things. There's asset context, there's threat context, and I guess the third thing would be, what are the outcomes, or what's the impact of this thing if it gets exploited or it gets used in a way that we don't want it to, right? What's the potential impact? And you use these three categories of data to actually make educated guesses. Because, for example, you can't go finding by finding, especially in an organization of any size, and do this just at scale, right? So scale becomes the challenge that most folks have when it comes to a threat modeling approach. And the goal is to take these different types of findings, and you use things like asset context and impact to tie them together into a single normalized list. And that single normalized list, then, because you had to tie things together in a special way, now you have to have your own, like, really customized prioritization scale, right? You need your own methodology to normalize it all into one place. And so what we'll see is the example on the right is you start with things like CVEs and configurations. Configurations have to roll into assets. Assets then need to go into asset groups. Asset groups then can be merged together into a single normalized list. And so there are ways to take this data and merge it all into one spot. Most common example would be, hey, default password. We know that the impact of that is that somebody is going to be able to log in as that user. What does that mean, right? So in order to truly know what that means at big scale, is to say, well, what asset is it on? Is that asset publicly facing? Is it connected to other assets? All this data is available to you in an organization. The question becomes, how do you automatically make that happen at scale? So triage is the first step, and I love threat modeling. And if anybody has any questions about how to do threat modeling, it's generally the first step, and it can be a little overwhelming, especially if you haven't done, I call it like simplified threat models to make educated guesses at scale. But if you have any questions about that, feel free to drop them in. Happy to talk through it further as well. But once you've triaged and you've really looked at how do we get this all into a normalized list, this is the key, right? And the reason it's the key is because prioritization is the next step. Now, I have I think it's a hot take here. Who knows? We'll find out. CVSS gets a really bad rap, right? A rep. It has a really bad brand in the industry, which is interesting because so many organizations use it. It's kind of like saying we have these sentiments where it's like, hey, I don't like Kleenex because, I don't like what like Kleenex stands for, but then everybody goes and uses Kleenex when they get sick. It's a similar dynamic in the industry where we all say, hey, we hate CVSS, but then nobody uses anything else really. And then the approaches that people use in exchange for CVSS is a CVSS. It's basically the same type of approach that CVSS uses, just differently and customized to your organization. And then we call it risk-based. And we start to say, oh, this is so much better than CVSS because we're using risk-based approaches instead of CVSS. But that misses the point of why CVSS doesn't work. CVSS doesn't work not because the algorithm itself is some really bad algorithm, right? We have spent a lot of time, a lot of money, and a lot of brain power building CVSS algorithms. The reason CVSS breaks down is because all CVE-based prioritization breaks down. It's not a CVSS specific problem. It's a problem with prioritization of all these different data types when you don't have CVEs in place, right? So the normalization of the data is the root of the problem. And then the second reason is because nobody uses CVSS correctly. They only use the base scores in general. Now, that being said, it's not the organization's fault that this is the case, because calculating temporal scores and environmental scores is really difficult. I mean, it's not an easy thing to do, but the algorithm itself, at the root of it, it's not necessarily a bad algorithm. Its implementation is really, really challenging, right? And so what this means is that the root of the problem is you have to find ways of prioritizing across data types. And that's why CVE-based prioritization has a really hard time at scale in a big organization. And on the right-hand side here, I have an example of how you can be creative with your prioritization, because you do have to get creative if you want to prioritize effectively. And you have to do that knowing what you know. It's very contextual to your organization. That's why I tie back to, I love threat models. So this is something that I wrote a long time ago that I call an SLA cheat sheet. Now, basically, this is how do you set SLAs, not based on CVSS score, not based on other attributes, or like based on I was really against at the time sort of quantitative risk approaches. Not that I was against it, but I felt like there was a better way to really break down how to set up SLAs. Now, this is a good example of how you can leverage random attributes that make sense to your organization to set SLAs that have nothing to do with the CVSS score, right? Critical severity comes from your technical severity. That's your CVSS base score, but you're ignoring the environmental and temporal. But then if you tie it to other attributes about your asset, about the threat context, and about the impact, like, hey, we know that if this CVE gets exploited, that it's going to lead to remote code execution on a public-facing asset that's critical to our business, and that malware could proliferate on that, then we have the ability to tie together a really solid SLA that's built on these attributes and evidence rather than just on these scores. And so prioritization, unfortunately, I'm not going to give you a end all be all score today that you can use. We do have some additional guidance I can share after the fact if anybody's interested. If you are interested, just drop a note in the chat, and or your email. Actually, don't send your email in the chat. We'll reach out to you after the fact, and we'll get you hooked up. But the idea and the core crux of the idea here is you need to get creative with the way that you actually do prioritization in your environment, right? And you can do it based on attributes that matter to you. And that's how you can start to build a normalized prioritization at a higher level. But we need to be thinking about priorities, not just at CVEs. We need to be thinking about it across the findings, right? Because as vulnerability management experts, our job is to prioritize everything, not just CVEs. So that's the important crux here. And an example of that would be setting your response benchmarks. So a response benchmark, just to be clear, what I mean by that is the what should happen. Like if X is true, then what should occur? And I have this here based on an EPSS percentile. So for those that aren't familiar with EPSS, it's an exploit predictive scoring system. It's an ML-based prediction system that some of our friends over at Scientia Institute have created. It's public, so you can go look at it. where it basically attempts to predict the likelihood that a vulnerability is going to be exploited in the next 30 days. So that's what that is for those that don't know. And the idea is you can take this attribute and then you can tie asset information and data information about stuff on that asset. And you can build with just one attribute. You can build really interesting responses where we actually know that just on, hey, what's the likelihood that this thing could get exploited? And it's on a critical asset and it's on, an asset that is processing tons of sensitive data. You have all these paths you can go down. And you can use that with any attribute that you care about. So like, for example, you could define, hey, the impact is that data exfiltration will happen. So it's not even based on probability of a thing being exploited anymore. We can just say, hey, what's the what will happen if, what is the impact, I should say? What is the impact of this weak password configuration? Does it lead to data exfiltration? Great. In that case, now we can tie it to the same attributes that we're looking at from an asset and data perspective, and we can still build really not complex, but really substantive types of workflows and responses. But you need to set the response benchmarks based on the attributes that you've defined as important to you that tie it all together in a single way, right? So that's the context here. And it leads to a really interesting question, right? And this is going to be the philosophical question I'm going to leave you all with today. As an organization, who should own vulnerabilities and who should own findings and who should own findings of different types? And so there generally are two distinct, wholly different ways that we see customers leverage their organizational structure to get the outcomes that they're looking for. We've seen both be successful, and they both have pros and cons to them. The first option is what we call a centralized remediation strategy. So what that means is that you have a single vulnerability team who feeds all of their vulnerability, CWE, software data, everything into one central location. And that team is the team that is responsible for all remediation activities: patching, infrastructure as code, configuration, software development. But it's ultimately their responsibility, and they have purview and oversight over all of it. And then they work with their teams for remediation. So you might have an AppSec expert who reports up to your vulnerability management team or your product security team. And then that AppSec expert works with different development teams to help them fix vulnerabilities. But it's the AppSec expert's job to make sure that those vulnerabilities get remediated. And then it's on the centralized team in general to make it happen, right? So that tends to be strategy number one. The second strategy is the opposite, right? It's distributed remediation ownership. What that means is every single person is responsible for their own vulnerabilities. That might be a little bit of a little large S there, but the idea is fundamentally that, right? Every person who owns an asset or has an asset is responsible and held accountable to being able to manage their own vulnerabilities. And so there are different requirements of what you need from systems to be able to handle each of these scenarios. But the idea would be, in this case, let's contrast that to the example we had before. The example before was one AppSec expert who goes around, embeds with each team, reports back up to a central VM team. In this case, you would generally have a product security team, a code security team, a vulnerability security team, a patch management team, and they're responsible for the different stovepipes of types of findings, and then they will embed with the different teams. So you might, for example, if you have 10 development teams, each development team will have a resident AppSec expert who's been trained, and you have like an AppSec guru or an AppSec, maybe you have an AppSec guild as part of your development organization. And so you own vulnerabilities fundamentally at the individual level. And then the problem becomes, how do you communicate vulnerabilities, just the vulnerabilities that they're responsible for, just the findings really at that organizational level. So that's the idea and the differences between these two. And so we see both of these can be successful, very culturally dependent on the organization, depends on the tools you have available, depends on your company's and the organization's way of doing business. If you're a very cloud-centric, cloud-heavy organization that's super distributed with lots of products, lots of AppSec teams, you probably want to go the distributed route and figure out how you deliver vulnerability data inside of the cycles that they're generating them. But if you're a little bit more traditional, I don't even want to say the word traditional, but let's say you're half in the cloud, half on-prem, half OT, to make up a solid 150%. I'm great at math. And you basically can say, well, all of this makes sense to manage in a single place, and then we can hold people accountable differently. So it's all about how you want to manage the remediation strategies to determine how you want to go about this. But no matter what, no matter which strategy you choose, you need a single unified system for prioritizing. And so no matter what you choose, you need to have somebody somewhere who owns here's how we think about the risk. We're a team. It doesn't have to be a single person. But and the answer is generally not Abysso, by the way. We see that as a common new pattern now. It doesn't seem to have the impact, at least on vulnerability management, that we think organizations expect. That's a whole other topic for a whole other day. So let's just wrap up. I know it's been about 30 minutes. I don't like these to go super long just because who needs to listen to more vendor pitches? But if we really distill it down, you need a single normalized list of all findings. It needs to be more than just CVEs, and it needs to be more than just CVEs plus configuration. You need to be thinking about it at a very high level. Infrastructure as code, patch management, software development. All of that needs to be taken into consideration, and you need to figure out who owns what once it's all on a single normalized list. The second is you need to have a consistent way of prioritizing at a global level, while still giving folks on teams the ability to adjust their workflows and engage with the data at their level, right? And then this is a really important thing that I don't hear talked about. You need to report on the same metrics across findings of all types, not just CVEs. So we talk all the time. I hear it all the time. Show me my number of vulnerabilities that were resolved within SLAs. Well, guess what? Most configuration findings don't have SLA policies tied to them. So now we're only tracking basically CVEs being remediated from a vulnerability scanner as part of our metrics to our risk. So we're reporting our vulnerability management metrics basically CVE based and not configuration based, not infrastructure as code based. And so you have these gaps in your metrics if you don't also measure all the different types of findings. Like, whose responsibility is it to have that full visibility? And I would argue that it's the VM team that is responsible for that, because our job is to reduce technical risk, and all of this represents technical risk. We can have specializations, but we need it all in one spot. And then the final thing is making these decisions on what should be centralized versus distributed ownership, and that needs to happen at the organizational level. You need to figure it out. You need a threat model. You need to figure out what your organization's culture is, and this is a really challenging thing. I don't deny it. You have to be able to maneuver through your organization to figure out the right VM strategy, and it's different for everybody. So with that, we have come to the end of today's session. Happy to follow up after. If you have any questions, feel free to email us, all that sort of fun stuff. I'm happy to answer questions right now. But in the meantime, I mentioned EPSS today. Nucleus is actually really proud. We sponsored a report from Scientia Institute with the founders of EPSS, and we're going to have them on our webinar next month to talk about EPSS, how it can be used, how it shouldn't be used. And then we also we have Stephen Schaefer from Peloton. He is one of their top VM people. He might actually be their top VM person at Peloton, and he is going to explain how they use EPSS at Peloton. And then I'll be here just kind of as a garnish, if you will. So if you're interested in learning about EPSS, how to actually use it, that's going to be the topic of next month's webinar. And then there's also one question, which is great. I always love questions. The question is, how do you detect non-CVE vulnerabilities? So what are the best ways to detect non-CVEs? So that is highly dependent, is unfortunately the answer. So if you are using a traditional vulnerability scanning tool, like a Tenable, Qualys, Rapid7, they actually have plugins not just to detect your vulnerabilities, but actually to also detect things like technical configurations. So this is super common, and it will show up as compliance findings. So there's like vulnerability type findings, and then there's compliance type findings. So you need to make sure that you are using, you have to pick which benchmarks you would like to assess against. And the caveat there is that you have to be either doing an authorized scan or an agent-based scan in order to do those detections. You're not going to get good results if you just do an unauthenticated type of vulnerability scan. So that's one way. The second way is there's actually specific special tools that have been designed to do benchmark scanning. So, man, I don't know if any of you out there are going to remember this tool, but to assess against the CIS benchmarks, there's actually an open source tool out there called Syscat that all they do is scan against CIS benchmarks, and you have to load the right CIS benchmarks you want to assess against. You install a little agent, and then it goes and does those assessments. If you're in the federal government, there's these things called SCAP scans. So you have to do scans like that. So it really depends on what benchmark you'd like to assess against. The unfortunate reality is there's not equal coverage. And in cloud environments is different than in OT environments, which is different than your traditional IT environment. So it's going to be specialized based on the requirements of your scanned infrastructure that you need. Hopefully that points you in the right direction. Obviously, feel free to engage with us too, and we can give you more specific info afterwards as well if you're interested. So appreciate the question. And then, as always, anybody that wants to check out Nucleus, gotta do the gratuitous. So appreciate the time, everybody. Obviously we help with a lot of these challenges as well. We unify data. So we're happy to give you a demo of how we do it. And with that, look at that. We came in at 41 minutes, and I very much appreciate everybody's time today. Feel free to, we'll reach out to those that said they're interested in how we can talk about thinking about prioritization, and we'll go from there. So appreciate everybody's time, and we'll see y'all again next time.